The cowboy took in the widow and her sister, but both brides begged to warm his bedroll. The sun had barely risen over the rolling hills when the cowboy rode slowly into the small town that seemed almost forgotten by time. Dust rose from his horse's hooves, mixing with the faint smell of wood smoke from the few scattered cabins. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a face weathered by wind and sun, yet his eyes were calm and thoughtful. He had spent most of his life alone, living by the rhythm of the seasons and the herd. To him, companionship had always been a rare luxury, and he had grown accustomed to the quiet that only the open plains could provide. It was on that crisp morning that he noticed two women standing at the edge of the road, their belongings bundled into worn cloth sacks. One was older, her face lined with sorrow, and the other younger, with eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of fear. They looked out of place in the rugged landscape, their shoes scuffed and their clothes patched. Even from a distance, the cowboy could sense their exhaustion, the weight of hard days and harder nights pressing down on them. As he rode closer, the older woman stepped forward and spoke, her voice carrying a mix of hope and desperation. "Sir? Please, we have nowhere to go. Could you help us?" howled, studying them quietly. He was used to strangers, travelers, and the occasional lost soul, but there was something different about these women. They carried with them a sense of loss, yet also a quiet strength.
He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the dry earth, and nodded.
"You'll find shelter at my ranch," he said simply. "It's not far from here. You can stay as long as you need." Relief washed over the women's faces. The older one, the widow, gave a small shaky smile, while the younger sister's eyes sparkled with cautious hope. They followed him, walking beside his horse, their steps careful but eager. The journey to the ranch was quiet, except for the soft whinny of the horse and the occasional sound of birds in the trees. The cowboy led them along narrow trails that wound between hills, through fields dotted with wildflowers and tall grasses. The ranch itself was modest but sturdy, a testament to years of hard work. A wooden fence enclosed the property, and a small cabin stood near the center, smoke curling from its chimney. The cowboy led the women inside, showing them to a room that had been prepared for guests. It was simple, with 2 beds, a small dresser, and a wooden floor that creaked slightly underfoot. "You can rest here," he said. "There's food in the kitchen. Make yourselves comfortable." The widow and her sister nodded gratefully. The older woman's hands trembled slightly as she set down her bag, while the younger sister moved quickly to inspect the room, her energy and curiosity a stark contrast to her sister's exhaustion. That night, the ranch was quiet. The cowboy tended to the fire in the hearth, throwing in logs with practiced hands. He listened to the crackle of flames and thought about the unusual turn his life had taken. He had always valued solitude, yet there was a part of him that felt a sense of purpose in helping these women. Perhaps it was their vulnerability, or perhaps it was the reminder that life was more than just survival. The widow sat by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Her mind wandered to the events that had brought her here, the loss of her husband, the struggle to care for her family, and the endless uncertainty that had followed. She had never expected kindness in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving, and yet here she was, offered shelter by a man she barely knew. Her sister, meanwhile, was restless. She moved about the cabin, tidying small things, arranging the few belongings they had, and occasionally glancing at the cowboy with curiosity. She had grown up watching her sister face life with quiet strength, and she admired her, yet she also knew that life could be fleeting and unpredictable. The ranch was a strange new world for her, filled with unfamiliar sounds, smells, and routines. Yet there was a comfort here, a sense that, for the first time in a long while, they were safe. Over the next few days, the cowboy introduced them to life on the ranch. He showed them how to care for the horses, feed the cattle, and gather firewood. The widow proved to be diligent and careful, learning quickly and handling tasks with a quiet determination. Her sister was more playful, sometimes clumsy, but always eager to help and learn. They were not just workers. They were companions in a place where companionship had been scarce. As the days passed, the cowboy began to notice subtle signs of their personalities. The widow was thoughtful, often pausing to observe the land, the animals, and the changing weather. She asked questions not out of ignorance, but out of a desire to understand and adapt. Her sister was bold, curious, and unafraid to speak her mind. She laughed easily, and her presence brought a liveliness to the ranch that had been missing for years. Despite the peaceful routine, there was an undercurrent of tension. Both women were aware of the cowboy's quiet strength and reliability. They had seen the way he moved, spoke, and handled the challenges of the ranch. There was a subtle admiration, a recognition of someone who had endured hardship, yet remained steadfast. It was natural that they would feel drawn to him, even if only in small, cautious ways. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, the cowboy sat by the fire repairing the saddle. The widow approached, carrying a small basket of food she had prepared. "Thank you," she said softly, placing it beside him, "for everything you've done for us." He looked up, nodding. "It's nothing. You needed a place to stay. That's all." But the widow's eyes lingered on him, a mix of gratitude and something more complex that she could not yet name. She returned to her room quietly, leaving the cowboy to his thoughts. Later that night, the younger sister peered out the window, watching the stars twinkle above the ranch. She thought about the cowboy, the way he had helped them without question, the way he had treated them with respect, and the quiet strength that seemed to surround him. She felt a mix of admiration, curiosity, and something warmer that she did not fully understand. The nights on the ranch were long and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and the animals settled into their routines. The cowboy often found himself awake, staring into the fire, reflecting on the unexpected arrival of the two women. He had never sought companionship, yet now, in the quiet of the night, he felt a connection he could not easily define. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between them grew. The cowboy began to see them not just as guests, but as part of his life. He appreciated the widow's thoughtfulness, her steady hands, and her quiet resilience. He found himself smiling at the younger sister's energy, her curiosity, and the way she brought light to the ranch. They were not family, not yet, but they were becoming something more, a presence that filled the emptiness he had grown used to. One evening after a long day of work, they all sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of orange and pink. The widow leaned back in her chair, exhausted but content, while her sister fidgeted, clearly trying to hide her excitement at being part of this new world. The cowboy looked at them both, feeling a warmth he had not felt in years. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of a connection that promised comfort, trust, and perhaps something more. In those quiet moments, the cowboy realized that life on the ranch had changed. He was no longer alone in the way he had been for so long. The presence of the widow and her sister had brought both responsibility and companionship, and he knew that the days ahead would test all of them. But for now, as the fire flickered and the stars appeared one by one, there was a sense of peace, of belonging, and of hope. The nights continued in that rhythm: work, meals, quiet conversation, and the occasional shared laughter. Both women found ways to support each other and the cowboy learned to appreciate the small gestures of care and affection that had once seemed unnecessary in his solitary life. The ranch became more than a home. It became a place of shared stories, quiet understanding, and mutual respect. Yet beneath the surface, there was a tension that neither the cowboy nor the women could ignore. Both sisters had begun to notice the ways they were drawn to him, not just for protection or shelter, but for the warmth of his presence, his steady gaze, and the quiet reassurance he provided. It was a delicate situation, one that required careful thought, patience, and understanding. As the first part of this story closes, the cowboy stands outside his cabin looking at the horizon. The land stretches endlessly before him, filled with challenges and beauty alike. Behind him, the two women settle in for the night, unaware of the thoughts swirling in his mind. The seeds of connection, trust, and perhaps love have been planted, but how they will grow remains a question for the coming days. For now, the cowboy, the widow, and her sister have found each other in the vast expanse of the plains. A chance encounter that promises change, challenges, and the possibility of a bond that neither time nor distance can easily break. And as the fire dies down and the stars watch over the ranch, the quiet tension of anticipation lingers, hinting at the trials and choices that lie ahead. The mornings at the ranch had started to feel less like work and more like routine, a rhythm that included everyone. The cowboy had taken to rising before dawn, checking on the horses and cattle, and preparing a simple breakfast of eggs and bread. The widow and her sister had begun to follow along naturally, learning to anticipate what needed to be done without being told. Their movements were careful, respectful, but also filled with curiosity. It was clear that they were adapting quickly to a life so different from the one they had known. The widow, for all her quiet strength, had a softness that the cowboy noticed. She was thoughtful, often pausing mid-task to look at the horizon, as if she were searching for something she had lost. There was a sadness in her eyes, a lingering grief for the life she had left behind, yet she carried herself with dignity. The younger sister was different, lively, energetic, and sometimes impulsive. She laughed easily and had a way of asking questions that made the cowboy chuckle despite himself. Her curiosity was boundless, from the way he saddled a horse to the way he mended a fence. As the days passed, The women grew more confident with the work on the ranch. The widow handled the animals with care, speaking softly to the horses and cattle, and showing a natural understanding of their moods. The younger sister, though occasionally clumsy, had an instinctive boldness that allowed her to tackle challenges without hesitation. She would often try things before asking, learning from the mistakes she made along the way. Their presence was no longer a disruption. It had become a part of the ranch's rhythm, and the cowboy had to admit, quietly, that he was beginning to enjoy it. Evenings were the most revealing. After a long day, they would gather near the cabin, sitting around the fire, with tired hands and warm hearts. The widow would quietly share stories from her past, tales of her husband, and the struggles she had faced raising her family alone. The cowboy listened with respect, often nodding but rarely interrupting. He had never been a man of many words, but he understood the value of listening. Her sister would add her own stories, full of humor, wonder, and occasional exaggeration. Their laughter was infectious, and for the first time in years, the cowboy felt a lightness he hadn't known he was missing. Yet, amid the growing companionship, a subtle tension began to form. The widow and her sister both noticed it, the way the cowboy would glance at them, sometimes lingering on their faces longer than necessary, the quiet way he would offer help even when it was not required, and the calm assurance in his presence. It was not the tension of conflict, but of unspoken connection. Both women found themselves thinking about him more often, drawn to his quiet strength and the kindness he showed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in deep shades of orange and pink, the widow approached him as he tended to the fire. "You make this look easy," she said softly, handing him a small bundle of kindling. Her hands brushed his for a moment, and though it was brief, the contact sent a subtle warmth through both of them. The cowboy nodded, accepting the kindling with a small smile. "It takes practice," he said, "and patience." His voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of experience. He watched as she returned to her seat by the cabin, noting the way she moved, careful yet graceful. He found himself admiring her quiet determination, the resilience that had carried her through so much loss. Meanwhile, her sister was observing from a short distance, a playful smile on her lips. She had always been more direct with her emotions, and she could not help but notice the way her older sister seemed to draw his attention. A small flicker of jealousy or protectiveness crossed her mind, though she quickly dismissed it, focusing instead on the warmth of the fire and the sense of belonging that was slowly settling over all three of them. As the nights grew colder, the practical need for warmth brought them closer together. Blankets were shared, and the fire became a central point where all three would gather. The cowboy noticed the way the women instinctively moved toward him, seeking comfort and reassurance in the simple presence of another human being. It was a natural, innocent desire for connection, yet it was unmistakably present. He found himself thinking about them in moments when he was alone, reflecting on the unusual dynamic that had formed. One particularly cold night, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows of the cabin. The women had prepared a simple meal, and after eating they settled near the fire, wrapped in blankets. The cowboy, noticing their discomfort, added another log to the flames and adjusted their seating so they could feel the warmth more evenly. The widow spoke softly. "We've never had a place like this, somewhere safe where we can rest without worry." Her words were sincere, filled with gratitude. The cowboy nodded, accepting the compliment with quiet humility. "It's not much, but it's enough," he replied. "And you're welcome here, as long as you need." Her sister leaned forward slightly, her voice light but earnest. "It feels like home," she said. There was a simplicity in her words, yet they carried a depth of feeling that surprised even the cowboy. He glanced at her, noting the hope and warmth in her eyes, and felt a pang of emotion he could not quite name. The days that followed brought small, intimate moments that deepened their connection. The cowboy noticed the widow's careful attention to detail, the way she organized supplies, tended to the animals, and quietly anticipated his needs. He began to rely on her judgment and found comfort in her steady presence. Her sister brought joy and laughter, often breaking the monotony of ranch life with her playful antics or sudden bursts of curiosity. The ranch, once a place of solitude and routine, had transformed into a space filled with life, warmth, and subtle emotional currents. There were moments when the tension became almost tangible. The cowboy found himself lingering slightly longer when handing tools or sharing instructions. The widow would occasionally catch his gaze, her heart skipping a beat, before quickly looking away. Her sister, more expressive and bold, would smile knowingly, teasing lightly, though her words were always gentle and innocent. The dynamic between the three was delicate, a careful balance of respect admiration, and unspoken longing. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a section of the fence, the younger sister stumbled on a loose board. The cowboy caught her quickly, steadying her before she fell. Their hands met briefly, and the contact was enough to make both of them pause for a heartbeat. She looked up at him, eyes wide, and smiled, a mix of relief and mischief. "Thanks," she said softly. "I guess I can't do everything on my own." "No one can," he said. "Sometimes we need a little help." He stepped back to allow her to continue, but the moment lingered in their minds longer than either expected. As evening approached, they returned to the cabin, exhausted but content. The fire was already lit, casting a warm glow across the room. They settled into their usual spots, the quiet of the evening settling over them like a blanket. The cowboy found himself reflecting on the unusual and delicate balance of their relationship. It was no longer just about shelter and survival. It was about companionship, trust, and the beginnings of emotional intimacy. The widow spoke quietly, almost to herself. "I never thought I would find a place like this, not after everything." Her sister nodded, adding, "It's strange, but good. Really good." Their words were simple, yet they carried a profound sense of relief and gratitude. The cowboy listened, feeling a mixture of pride, protectiveness, and something warmer he could not name. He had spent years alone, relying on only himself. Now he realized that life could be richer, fuller, and more meaningful when shared with others. He understood the responsibility that came with accepting these women into his life, but he also felt the quiet joy of connection, the kind that only grows through shared work, trust, and care. Nights on the ranch became a time for reflection and quiet conversation. They shared stories, dreams, and fears, slowly building a foundation of trust. The cowboy learned about the widow's past, her strength, and her gentle nature. He discovered the younger sister's curiosity, playfulness, and unwavering loyalty to her family. Each conversation, each small gesture of kindness, brought them closer, creating a bond that was as natural as it was unexpected. Though the emotional tension was present, it was never forced or inappropriate. Instead, it was a reflection of human connection, the need for warmth, companionship, and understanding. Both women admired the cowboy's steady strength, while he appreciated their resilience, humor, and the ways they softened the edges of his solitary life. Together they formed a delicate balance, each contributing to the well-being and happiness of the others. As Part 2 draws to a close, the ranch is no longer just a place of work. It has become a home. The cowboy, the widow, and her sister have established a rhythm, a life that is both challenging and rewarding. The emotional bonds are growing stronger, yet the tension of unspoken feelings lingers, hinting at challenges and choices that lie ahead. The warmth of the fire, the shared laughter, and the quiet understanding between them set the stage for the trials and decisions that the coming months will bring. In this simple, rugged life, the seeds of connection and trust have been firmly planted. The days are filled with work, the evenings with companionship, and the nights with quiet reflection. And though no one knows what the future holds, one thing is certain: the cowboy, the widow, and her sister have begun a journey together, one that will test their hearts, their loyalty, and the bonds that are slowly, surely forming between them. Winter had arrived on the ranch, and with it came biting winds that swept across the plains. The days were shorter, the nights longer, and the cold settled deep into the bones of anyone who spent time outdoors. The cowboy had long grown used to the harshness of the seasons, but this winter felt particularly unforgiving. Even the fire in the cabin seemed to struggle against the relentless chill. The widow and her sister adapted as best they could, layering themselves in thick clothing and blankets, helping with chores when possible. But the cold forced everyone indoors sooner than usual, and the trio found themselves spending long hours together in the small cabin. At first, the increased proximity was quiet and practical, tending to the fire, preparing meals, mending clothes. But it soon became clear that living so closely brought with it emotions they could no longer ignore. One afternoon, the wind began to howl with unusual intensity, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin. The cowboy checked on the horses and livestock, ensuring they were fed and sheltered before the storm fully hit. When he returned, the wind had turned into a blizzard thick with snow that drifted against the cabin walls. The cold was sharp and unyielding, and he realized that leaving the cabin was no longer an option. "We'll have to stay inside until it passes," he said, his voice calm but firm. The widow nodded, eyes wide with concern. Her sister, ever curious, peered out the frosted window, her face pressed against the glass. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "and scary at the same time." The cowboy nodded silently, setting more wood on the fire and adjusting the blankets around the room. The cabin, once merely a shelter, had become a haven. The crackle of the fire was the only sound besides the wind, and in that quiet, the three of them felt both the weight of the storm outside and the warmth of companionship inside. As night fell, the storm intensified. Snow piled against the doors and windows, and the fire became their lifeline. They huddled together, sharing blankets and warmth, and for the first time the emotional closeness became unavoidable. The widow and her sister instinctively moved closer to the cowboy, seeking not only warmth but also reassurance, comfort, and the feeling of safety that only his presence could provide. The widow spoke first, her voice soft and unsteady. "We've never been through something like this. It feels endless." Her words carried not just fear, but also a subtle trust, a recognition that he could protect them, not just from the storm, but from the uncertainty of life itself. The cowboy nodded, resting a reassuring hand on the edge of her chair. "It will pass," he said simply. "Storms always do. We just have to stay safe until it does." Her sister leaned forward slightly, a boldness in her expression despite the cold. "It's hard, being trapped like this, but I'm glad we're together." She glanced at the cowboy, her voice carrying warmth and honesty. He met her gaze briefly, acknowledging the sentiment without saying much. Words were not always necessary. The quiet presence of another human being was sometimes enough to communicate trust and affection. The storm forced them into closer contact than they had experienced before. Meals were shared by the fire, blankets were passed and layered, and every small task was done side by side. The cowboy began to notice the subtle ways both women leaned toward him, not out of obligation, but out of comfort and trust. He felt a mixture of pride, protectiveness, and something deeper that he could not fully define. Even in these confined moments, life on the ranch continued in small, necessary ways. They repaired tools by the fire, cleaned the cabin, and checked supplies. The widow proved invaluable, her steady hands and careful thought guiding them through practical problems. Her sister brought energy and humor, teasing gently and making small jokes to lighten the tension. The cowboy found himself smiling more than he had in years, the warmth of human connection countering the cold outside. But the emotional tension grew as well. Both women were aware of their feelings and the subtle attraction they felt for him. They watched the way he moved, the quiet strength in his hands, and the patience in his eyes. At the same time, the cowboy felt the weight of responsibility. He cared deeply for both women, but he did not want to hurt either. His life had been built on rules, respect, and fairness, and he was determined not to let emotions cloud his judgment in a way that would damage the trust they had built. One particularly long night, the storm raged on with relentless force. The fire was low and the wind whistled through every crack. The cowboy checked on the supplies, made sure the blankets were arranged properly, and then settled near the fire. Both women moved closer, instinctively drawn by the warmth and safety of his presence. They spoke quietly, their voices blending with the sound of the wind. "I never thought I'd feel this safe," the widow admitted, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Not after everything that's happened." The cowboy nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. She had lost so much, yet here she was, willing to trust again. Her sister added, "It's strange, but I feel like we belong here, with you, with each other. It's more than I expected." Her words were simple, yet they carried honesty and longing. The cowboy felt a quiet warmth in his chest. He realized that his decision to take them in had brought him not only companionship, but also a deep sense of responsibility and connection. As the night wore on, the blizzard showed no sign of slowing. The three of them remained close, wrapped in blankets, sharing stories, laughter, and moments of silence that spoke volumes. The cowboy began to understand the depth of their dependence on him, not only for physical safety, but also for emotional comfort. He knew that the storm outside mirrored the storm of emotions inside the cabin: fear, longing, trust, and the unspoken desire for closeness. The next day, the storm persisted, and the isolation forced them to confront their feelings more directly. They moved about the cabin in careful coordination, helping one another with tasks and ensuring that everyone remained warm and fed. There were moments when their hands brushed, and neither moved away quickly. There were glances exchanged over the fire that carried understanding and subtle admiration. The cowboy found himself reflecting on how unusual the situation was, yet how natural it felt. Evenings became a time of reflection. They would sit by the fire, sharing quiet conversations that revealed their fears, hopes, and dreams. The widow spoke of her past, of the hardships she had endured, and the lessons she had learned. Her sister shared her curiosity about the world, her desire for adventure, and her admiration for those who faced life with courage. The cowboy listened and responded when necessary, offering advice, encouragement, or simply silent support. Despite the closeness, he remained cautious. He did not want to let emotions cloud his judgment or create tension between the two women. He valued fairness and respect above all else, and he understood that navigating these feelings required patience and thoughtfulness. He also recognized that both women were drawn to him for reasons beyond mere survival. They saw connection, comfort, and trust, and he could not ignore the subtle warmth that this brought into his life. One evening, the younger sister leaned forward, speaking softly. "It feels like we're a family here. Even if it's strange, I like it." She glanced at her sister and then at the cowboy. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to be part of it." The cowboy's heart swelled with quiet emotion. He nodded, acknowledging her words, and felt the weight of the responsibility and honor in having their trust. The widow added, "We're grateful more than we can say. You've given us more than shelter." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. The cowboy understood the depth of her gratitude and the strength of her character. He realized that this moment, these shared nights, the trust, the warmth, was shaping all of their lives in ways that none of them had anticipated. As the storm began to wane, snow piling high against the cabin walls, the trio realized that the experience had changed them. They had faced fear, isolation, and the unknown together. They had shared warmth, laughter, and trust, and in doing so they had formed a bond that was stronger than the hardships they had endured. The cowboy looked at the two women, noting the subtle ways they had grown close to him and to each other. He knew that the coming days would bring decisions, challenges, and perhaps difficult choices. But he also understood that the connection they had formed could not be ignored. It was a bond built on trust, respect, and shared experience, and it demanded attention, care, and honesty. Part 3 closed with the blizzard finally letting up. The sun rose weakly over the snow-covered plains, casting a pale light over the ranch. The cabin, once a simple shelter, had become a place of safety, warmth, and emotional growth. The cowboy, the widow, and her sister emerged from the storm with a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. The emotional tension remained, subtle but undeniable, hinting at the choices, challenges, and possibilities that lay ahead. In the quiet after the storm, as they stepped outside and breathed the crisp winter air, each of them felt a sense of connection that had been forged through shared hardship. The bond between them was no longer just practical. It was emotional, strong, and undeniable. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. They had faced the storm together, and together they had found warmth, trust, and a sense of belonging that would guide the days to come. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the ranch after the long storm. The snow did not disappear all at once, but day by day the sun grew a little stronger. Ice melted from the roof in small dripping lines, and the horses started moving more freely in their enclosure. The air was still cold, but there was a quiet promise of change. For the cowboy, the widow, and her sister, the end of the storm felt like the beginning of something new, though none of them were completely sure what that new chapter would look like. The first morning they stepped outside after the blizzard, the silence surprised them. The wind that had roared for days was gone. The land looked fresh and calm, covered in white, almost peaceful. The cowboy checked the animals carefully, making sure nothing had been damaged. The widow followed him, helping clear paths through the snow, while her sister carried supplies and kept spirits high with light conversation. They worked together naturally, without needing many words. The storm had strengthened their understanding of one another. Life did not suddenly become easy again. There was still hard work ahead. Fences needed repair, supplies had to be restocked, and animals required extra care after the harsh weather. But something had shifted between the three of them. There was more trust now, more comfort. The cowboy noticed that the ranch no longer felt empty when he woke up in the morning. The sound of the women moving about, preparing breakfast or organizing tools, brought a sense of life he had not realized he missed. The widow seemed calmer too. Before, there had always been a quiet sadness in her expression, a shadow left by her past. That sadness had not completely vanished, but it was softer now. She smiled more often. She spoke with confidence when discussing plans for the ranch. Sometimes the cowboy would catch her looking at the land with thoughtful eyes, as if imagining a future instead of remembering a loss. Her younger sister had also changed in subtle ways. She still had her playful nature, but she showed more patience now. She asked fewer impulsive questions and listened more. She worked harder without needing encouragement, clearly determined to prove that she belonged there not just as a guest, but as someone who contributed. One evening, after a long day repairing a broken fence, they sat together outside the cabin. The snow had begun melting into soft patches of grass. The sky glowed with warm sunset colors, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. No storm, no uncertainty, just the quiet beauty of the land.
The younger sister broke the silence first.
"I never thought this place would start feeling like home," she said softly. "At first it was just shelter. Now it feels different." The widow nodded slowly. "Yes. It feels stable. Safe. Something I haven't felt in a long time." The cowboy listened quietly. He understood what they meant because he felt it too. For years the ranch had been only a workplace, a responsibility. Now it had warmth. Now it had shared laughter, shared meals, shared silence. "I'm glad you stayed," he finally said. His voice was simple but sincere. Neither woman replied immediately, yet their expressions showed they felt the same. As the weeks passed, spring began showing clear signs. Snow almost disappeared, rivers flowed stronger, and the animals became more active. With better weather came more work, but also more opportunities to enjoy the outdoors. They often worked side by side in the fields, sometimes talking, sometimes comfortable in silence. The cowboy started involving both women in decisions about the ranch. He asked their opinions on supplies, repairs, even future plans. At first they were hesitant, unsure if their voices truly mattered, but he made it clear they did. Gradually, their confidence grew. This shared responsibility strengthened their bond further. It was no longer simply a man offering shelter to two women in need. It was becoming a partnership built on respect. Still, emotions were complex. Both sisters cared deeply for him, and he cared for them. But rather than rushing into anything unclear, they chose patience. The storm had taught them that strong connections need time and honesty. One afternoon, while organizing the barn, the widow spoke privately with him. "You changed our lives," she said. "But I want you to know, we don't want to be a burden. We want to stand beside you, not behind you." He appreciated those words more than she probably realized. "You're not a burden," he replied. "You're part of this place now, and part of my life." It was quiet, steady, honest. And sometimes that kind of honesty means more than grand speeches. Her sister had a similar conversation a few days later. She was direct as always. "I admire you," she said, "not just because you helped us. 'Cause you treat people fairly. That matters to me." He smiled slightly. "Fairness is important, especially when people trust you." "And we do trust you," she answered. Those conversations brought clarity rather than confusion. Instead of competition or jealousy, the sisters supported each other. Their relationship remained strong, built on years of shared hardship. They understood that whatever future unfolded should protect that bond, not damage it. Community members from nearby ranches began visiting again once the weather improved. They noticed the change immediately. The once quiet ranch now had laughter, shared meals, and a welcoming atmosphere. Some were surprised, but most reacted positively. Hard times often create unusual families, and people on the frontier understood that better than anyone. Slowly, the trio became known as a team. The cowboy with his steady leadership, the widow with her calm wisdom, and the younger sister with her lively spirit. Each brought something valuable. Together, they created balance. One warm evening, they gathered around the fire outside instead of inside the cabin. The air was gentle, filled with the scent of grass and wood smoke. Stars appeared overhead, bright and clear. The widow spoke thoughtfully. "I think the storm gave us more than trouble. It gave us perspective." Her sister nodded. "It showed us what really matters." The cowboy looked at both of them. "And what's that?" "Belonging," her sister added. He considered their words carefully. They were right. Those were things he had lived without for a long time. From that point on, their life settled into a peaceful rhythm. There were still challenges, weather, work, unexpected problems, but they faced them together. Decisions were shared, responsibilities were balanced, and slowly a sense of family formed. Even if it did not fit traditional definitions, there was no dramatic final decision, no sudden declaration that changed everything overnight. Instead, there was steady growth, mutual care, respect, emotional warmth that did not need labels to exist. The cowboy realized he no longer measured his days by solitude. He measured them by shared moments. Morning coffee together, laughter during work, quiet evenings watching sunsets. The widow found strength not only in survival, but in hope. She allowed herself to imagine a future again. Her sister discovered stability without losing her lively nature. She remained curious and joyful, but now with a sense of direction. As spring turned fully into summer, the ranch flourished. Crops improved, animals thrived, and the cabin became a true home filled with life. One sunset, much like the first one they had shared months ago, they sat together on the porch. No tension, no uncertainty, just calm companionship. None of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Finally, the cowboy said quietly, "Funny how life works. Sometimes the hardest storms lead you exactly where you need to be." Her sister nodded in agreement, and in that peaceful silence they understood something important. Family is not always about blood or tradition. Sometimes it grows from kindness, trust, shared struggles, and the simple choice to stand by one another. Their journey had begun with loss, uncertainty, and a storm that seemed endless. It had led to stability, connection, and a quiet happiness none of them had expected. The ranch was no longer just land and buildings. It was a place of belonging, a place where 3 lives had come together, not perfectly, but meaningfully. And as the sun dipped below the horizon once again, casting warm golden light across the fields, they sat side by side. Not as strangers, not as guests, but as people who had found a shared path forward, steady and hopeful.